Good afternoon and welcome back to History 120, American history up to 1877. I want to start today talking about the colonial period in American history. Today we're going to talk about British colonization. Before we get started, we need to also understand other nations were involved in colonizing the United States. Spain colonized coastal California. At one time, they claimed possession of much of the inland west, all the way to the Rocky Mountains. They also held Florida, the Gulf Coast, and Louisiana for portions of time. The same can be said of the French in holding Louisiana as well as the interior from the Mississippi, in the area of the Mississippi River. The Dutch held the Hudson Valley. The Swedes settled New Jersey. There's a colonial power you never really hear about anymore. So I bring this up because by and large in American history classes, we concentrate on the aspects of British colonial history that most directly impact our national development. And while there is a very strong connection, we also need to understand that the British weren't the only ones colonizing the North American continent. What they did, however, was they colonized in a very singular manner that was different than what many of their European counterparts did in order to colonize and claim territory in North America. And we're going to talk about those colonies today. So, regional descriptions. Normally, when we talk about British North America or the British colonies in North America, we have three distinct regions that we talk about. We have New England, which is the Massachusetts colony and its neighbors. We have the Middle colonies, which are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. They're seen here in orange. And then we have the southern colonies, and the southern colonies tend to be the largest. Those are Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, etc. These colonies had separate times that they started. They had separate reasons why they started, and they had very distinct personalities and assets that set them apart from the other colonies. So you really can't talk about the British colonial experiment as a unified body that happened all in the same way. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how colonization really took place in varying waves. But one thing to keep in mind, no matter how these British colonies started or when these colonies became British, by the 1730s, all colonies were crown colonies that were ruled by the British government and were headed by colonial governors who had been appointed by the crown. All right. Perhaps most famously, and in some ways most mistakenly, what we talk when you ask why people came to America in the 17th century, especially the early 17th century, we hear arguments about freedom of religion. The Puritans came here so they could be free to practice their religion as they see fit. What we need to keep in mind is the separatists, as they referred to themselves, who established Plymouth Plantation and the first colony up in the New England area. They were coming to America to practice their religion as they saw fit, mainly because they practiced their religion in such a manner that no one could stand to be around them. They were separatists because this was a period of religious upheaval in England. The official Church of England, the Anglican Church, was seen by the Puritans as, in many ways, Catholicism light. It still had very heavy, impressive churches, impressive garments for bishops and priests, jewels, gold, pieces of art. And the Puritans felt that this distracted from their ability to worship God correctly. The separatists themselves were a subset of Puritans who felt that even the Puritans who wanted to change the Anglican Church to purify it were getting it wrong as well, and that the only correct way to worship God was in a very stark, plain, unadorned means of worship. And so the separatists, when they came over, yes, they were seeking to establish a place where they could worship as they saw fit, but it was because they did not want to be around anybody else. No one, while the Church of England was official, it would be very hard to say that no one was really persecuting the separatists. They had actually been in Holland for decades, wanting to get away from the English and the English Church. These were a bunch of not nice purists who viewed everybody else's practice of faith as inferior. And actually, when they came to North America, they would end up denying religious freedom to non-separatists who came with them or who settled in their area before the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was established in 1628, 8 years after Plymouth Plantation was established for the separatists. It was a joint stock corporation. This is very important for understanding how we financed New World exploration and settlement in the British model. Essentially, it costs money to go to the New World. Well, duh, Dr. Welch, we understand that. It's a boat ride. Boats are expensive. Yes, but you have to bring your family over. You have to have the money to purchase all the goods you're going to need from England for a year or 6 months from the time you arrive in the New World, because there's no grocery stores. You don't know the assets you're going to find. You may not be able to get a good crop in, so you have to plan long term when you're coming to the New World. It's very, very expensive. And there are people in England who see this as an opportunity to invest and make money on those who wish to go to the New World. And some of these people wish to go to the New World themselves. What it is in order to finance these expeditions to North America, investors come together to form a corporation called a joint stock corporation. They lay out the money for settlers to go to the New World. In return, they expect a return on their investment by the harvesting and shipping back of New World resources back to the mother country. Essentially, this is part of the mercantilist economy that is expanding out into the British North American world at this time. The colonies are to be a source of raw materials. And this is something we'll play on much more as we get closer to the Revolution. But if you're going to pay off the debts that you've accrued in order to come to North America, you need to have a commodity that you can send back. It would be very easy if you could find gold, jewels, rare minerals, etc. But by and large in North America, we don't have that. What we have is we have fur, we have lumber, we have fish. Fish can be dried and salted, and this is going to be very important to take back to England and sold in the English markets, because the fisheries around England and Northern Europe were becoming overfished. They needed these dried fish for food for the common people. Lumber is important because we need ships to go back and forth to the New World. We also need ships for naval dominance of the oceans. Britain's forests were cut down. They had been deforested, maybe for a couple of centuries by this point. So they needed wood to build ships, as well as furniture and other items made out of wood Fur is needed for hats. Fur is needed for fashion. So these are just three of the assets that we can send back to the old world in order to pay for our colonization of North America. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Puritan colony, not a separatist colony. They wanted to reform the Anglican Church. They weren't the same people who had established Salem, or the Plymouth and Salem, who were essentially religious extremists. In order to have political rights in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you had to be a confessed member of the church. In other words, if you were a Quaker, if you were an Anglican, if you were a Baptist, you wouldn't have political rights in the Massachusetts Bay Colony prior to the 18th century. It is a massive wave of migration. In 10 years, 20,000 Puritans will make their way to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which spread essentially from the edge of the Virginia colony all the way up north into what we now consider Maine. Also, what's going on with this at this time, we need to keep in mind the 1620s, we're in the period of English Civil War that's going on. The 30 Years' War is coming to an end. Europe had been divided by the Reformation into Catholics and Protestants, and people had been killing each other on the European continent over which religion was better for 130 years at this point. Because there's more than just the 30 Years' War that goes on after the Protestant Reformation. And the Puritans who are fleeing violence, who are fleeing the Civil War in England, see themselves as having an opportunity to establish a good Christian nation, a proper Christian nation as they defined it here in the New World. So the City on a Hill sermon that is sometimes cited when we talk about this period in Massachusetts history refers to their opportunity to be an example to the rest of the world for how to be a proper religious nation, as long as you practice the proper religion. If you're a separatist, you have questionable rights. If you're a Quaker, you could be hunted and killed if you were a Quaker in this period. So it's all about worshiping the right form of religion, even in the New World. By the 1690s, the Plymouth colony will merge into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, creating one unified Massachusetts Bay region under one type of government. From there, we need to deal with that question of lack of religious liberty. Rhode Island is established as a dissenting colony. Essentially, the first leaders of the Rhode Island colony were kicked out of Massachusetts for not following the official Puritan doctrine. The first one of these, 1636, Roger Williams is banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was charged with heresy and sedition against the state. He questioned the separation he questioned the religious rule of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He preached a differing doctrine, and he actually felt that there should be a separation of church and state, rather than having a religious state trying to create a perfect Christian nation. As such, he was banished for heresy. The Narragansetts, who he had a good relationship with, granted him land, which he called Providence Plantation. Roger Williams, interestingly enough, you could almost call him the first American anthropologist for the amount of time that he spent studying the Narragansetts and writing about them in his diaries and published letters. We have a great understanding of the Narragansett people and how they related to Europeans and the English because of Roger Williams. In 1638, Roger Williams is joined by Anne Hutchison and other religious dissenters who have been exiled and kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for believing something other than the official doctrinal teachings of the Puritan faith. And Hutcheson wanted a stronger role for women and a voice for women in the church and leadership roles. The Puritans didn't like that idea, so they kicked her out. And they kicked all of her followers out. She was a religious teacher. Essentially, Rhode Island is where you stick the people you don't want in Massachusetts Bay. They will be harassed by people from Massachusetts and other colonies. They'll seek recognition, which comes in 1644. And by and large, we have Rhode Island as a semi-religiously tolerant colony with good relations with the local indigenous populations for the next 4 decades, which is kind of aberrant for some of these other places. Connecticut officially gets its start as a Dutch trading post in the 1620s. This will be abandoned in the 1650s when the Dutch essentially sell out to the English. Again, we have another town, New Haven, Connecticut, is established in 1637 by more exiles from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Obviously, New Haven is their new haven in the wilderness. So again, Connecticut is kind of a trading post at best until more and more English move in and the Dutch abandon the area by the 1650s. New York also starts as a Dutch area. In 1609, it's established as the New Netherlands. The Dutch will purchase Manhattan Island in 1626 from local tribes. No, they will not purchase it for a handful of beads. They will actually exchange money and goods for Manhattan Island. It's just that they got very lucky on how little they had to actually spend monetarily for the island. The Dutch, when they settled the New World, were not looking for religious harbor, nor were they looking to establish great farms and control of territory in the New World. The Dutch wanted fur. The Dutch essentially wanted money. If you look at how, if you take a world history class, you'll learn how the Dutch really came to dominate the Pacific spice trades, controlling vast islands and controlling navigation lanes, being one of the few countries that could trade with feudal Japan, because they didn't impress their religion on anybody else. In North America, the asset they want is fur. Fur is used for hats up through the 19th century. We don't think about this very much. A hat was a very important and very fashionable piece of wardrobe for the average European, and they were running out of fur-bearing animals in Europe from which to make hats. And with the rise of North American exploration and the number of beaver, rabbits, deer, any number of mammals in the North American wilderness, this was the great fur emporium. So that's what the Dutch were here for. They did establish some farms along the Hudson River. Generally, these were part of what we call a patroon system. They gave massive grants of land to rich Dutchmen along the river, and then they broke it up into essentially a feudal estate where commoners could rent small tracts of land in order to grow farm commodities for sale, or garden crops for sale to the local city in order to make their rents, but they had lifetime tenant contracts. They were never able to purchase their land. That patroon system is actually going to last into the mid-19th century in some ways. But by and large, the patroon system for giving up and dividing land was really a small example of what the Dutch were trying to do in New York. They really just wanted to harvest the furs and trade with the natives. New York will be given to, well, essentially the English will invade and demand the colony in the 1660s, and they'll take over after the threat of war and invasion. What's interesting, something you can see here on this map of Manhattan Island of New Amsterdam, is you see a fort on the left-hand portion of the island. You see divisions of land, wilderness, maybe farms, and then you literally see a wall cutting off the end of the island. That's where Wall Street is today. That's how Wall Street got its name. That was literally the edge of the civilized world in New Amsterdam. This was, to go beyond that was to enter the wilderness and to leave civilization behind. That's where Wall Street gets its name. And I'm looking at the time right now. We've been about 20 minutes into lecture. I'm going to go ahead and leave it here for today. We'll get this video posted up, and we will pick up here next time in order to continue talking about the exploration of British North America. If you have any questions, drop me an email. Otherwise, have a great day.